This is an honor for me, first off.
The honor is all mine.
No, you are my idol, you're my mentor, you're my guiding light, you're my queen.
I think we should end it right here. I love it. This is the future of broadcast news. So
I have a great story. Everyone always says women in the news business are cutthroat and they're going to try and take you down. When I first started at NBC News, it was 2012, I think, and I was covering Hurricane Sandy. I'm standing in floodwaters in Hoboken, New Jersey, and I do a hit on Andrea Mitchell's MSNBC show at noon, which was thrilling for me as a brand new correspondent. And afterwards, she sent me a note saying, "Welcome to the team. We're so happy to have you. It's great to have another strong woman on board. You're doing a wonderful job." And I thought...
And of course, it's easy to write a nice note from behind the anchor desk to someone who's standing hip deep in water, which is the intrepid Katy Tur.
But it was amazing. I mean, I saved it, and I still have it to this day because it meant so much to me at the time. And it made me feel welcome at NBC, and you still do every single day. And it's lovely to commiserate with you now on politics.
Well, and the last time Katy was on the stage, it was being interviewed by Chuck Todd about her great book.
Yeah, that was a great, that was a really great evening. But this is going to be even better. Tonight, we have a ton to talk about, including a lot of your personal history, and I want to get into it, but there's breaking news, so we should touch on that. I just spent 40 minutes doing it on Meet the Press Daily. I want to get your take. Donald Trump asked his White House lawyer to tell the DOJ to prosecute his political enemies, really, James Comey and Hillary Clinton. Don McGahn had to tell him, you probably shouldn't do that, it's inappropriate. And it was so serious that he wrote up a memo. He had the White House write up a memo to give to Donald Trump, unclear if he read it, telling him why it would be such a bad idea.
And as Matt Miller, who is the former Justice Department spokesman, worked for Eric Holder, was tweeting tonight, this is a textbook case, if he had proceeded with this, of obstruction of justice. It shows his own vulnerabilities. He was protected by the White House counsel, Don McGahn, who has since left the White House recently. But this shows that the president has a completely different idea of what the Justice Department should be. He views it as his personal lawyer. And that's one of the reasons why he was always so frustrated with Jeff Sessions, and certainly initially with Rod Rosenstein, until he was persuaded he couldn't fire him. But he does have a very different view of what the Justice Department's function is. And there's no firewall, as far as he's concerned, between the people at the Justice Department and what his own particular interests are.
No, and what we should note is that there have been some guardrails up that have kept him from following some of his worst instincts. Don McGahn told him, no, this would be bad. It would open you up to all sorts of allegations, at the very least. Don McGahn's no longer in the White House. Rod Rosenstein is still technically in charge of the Mueller investigation, but now he has somebody over him who's in charge of everything. And this is somebody that Donald Trump hasn't had a negative word for. He's seen as a loyalist. So without the guardrails in place to protect him from his worst instincts and protect the country from his worst instincts, I think Andrea, we open ourselves up to a lot of potential calamities going forward.
And one of the issues is Chuck Schumer has today asked for an Inspector General report from the Justice Department into whether Matt Whitaker, when he was at DOJ, and since he's been acting Attorney General, was communicating privately to the White House and sharing information about the Mueller probe. Certainly whether he has done that since he took over from Rosenstein just in the last 2 weeks. And whether or not he gets that Inspector General investigation, he's raising a big issue, which certainly the House Democrats, when they take over the committees, are going to want to investigate. So it's pretty well understood by people at the Justice Department and by other Republican attorneys that Matt Whitaker is vulnerable, but the president is increasingly likely to want to keep him for the 10 months that he can keep him as acting, even though it very likely is not possible for him to be confirmed as Attorney General, because this is a man who has, in fact, in the past, when he was an Iowa lawyer and previously a prosecutor there, actually wrote that Marbury versus Madison, the foundational Supreme Court decision, from the earliest days of our founders, was wrongly decided. That is the Supreme Court decision that said that the courts have jurisdiction, that the Supreme Court has jurisdiction over.
There's balance of power.
Exactly.
There's checks and balances in our
So
country.
Matt Whitaker is not known as either a very good lawyer or a nonpartisan lawyer or someone who should be in charge of the Justice Department. And he jumped over, not only over people who were in line, Rod Rosenstein, deputy AG and an experienced prosecutor, but over anyone from any department who could have been put in there who had been previously confirmed by the United States Senate.
It doesn't exactly have support from Republicans either.
Correct.
Lindsey Graham and both Trey Gowdy have questioned the legality of that appointment and whether it circumvents advice and consent, which is something that you need for somebody in that sort of position. Since you know everything about every beat, I'm going to move on to another beat. State Department, your current beat. There's news today on Donald Trump and Saudi Arabia and the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Walk us through that.
Well, this broke during my noon hour. We plan all of these things, and I had done actually an extensive report on the Today program today, which was exclusive, and we were putting it on our hour.
And I booked you on my hour to talk about the same thing.
I know, and that's what we were going to talk about.
We did not,
We talked about Khashoggi. But fortunately, I had asked the former acting CIA director, John McLaughlin, who was also for many years the deputy CIA director, is now a professor at Johns Hopkins Graduate School of Foreign Policy, to come on the program to talk about this other issue, which was our exclusive reporting on the mysterious health attacks against American diplomats, first in Havana, 26 confirmed cases, which led to virtually the closing of our embassy and the reversal of the Obama opening to Cuba. Many of us initially thought that this was not for the protection of the diplomats, but that it fit neatly with President Trump's desire to reverse the Obama policy towards Cuba, which both of those things can be true at the same time. But now we have a case confirmed in China. Several other complaints from diplomats in China, but one confirmed case, medically determined by experts, dozens and dozens of doctors, and in particular doctors at the Brain Science Center at the University of Pennsylvania, but also previously at Hopkins and at the University of Miami, all working on these cases. And it was a case of a woman named Catherine Werner. She was 30 years old. She started feeling these terrible sensations. Her father noticed one night in a video chat, given the time difference with China, that she was acting very strangely. She was hesitant in her speech. She couldn't focus. Her eyes weren't focused. Her hearing was off, dizzy. And he woke his wife up, who was a retired Air Force veteran, and said, I'm buying a ticket to China. You have to go tomorrow. Something's wrong with our Catherine. So Laura Hughes, the mom, flies to China the next day. And within weeks, as she's trying to change air filters, bring bottled water, bring her own food, thinking it's external, it's pollution, we know how polluted China can be. Within weeks, mom is suffering the same syndrome.
Oh my gosh.
And they also feel that they are being surveilled and that there are intruders in the apartment. It's very upscale diplomatic housing complex. So they get 2 dogs. And within a couple of weeks, the dogs are vomiting blood.
What?
So we had Laura Hughes. I had interviewed her on camera last week, and we put the piece together for the Today program, and it's a really compelling story. That's what I was going to do on your show, but all this other stuff happened. In the middle of all this, Khashoggi breaks. The president puts out a statement inexplicably saying that despite the CIA's conclusions, which he is now challenging, which we have all reported, and believe me, it's extensively reported, they briefed it to the intelligence committees last Thursday, that they have high confidence that the Crown Prince, ally of the president's and of Jared Kushner's, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman ordered the murder himself. And that in that hit squad were his closest allies. Well, this is very hard evidence coming with high confidence from the CIA, bipartisan outrage. Lindsey Graham on Meet the Press saying, I will never deal with Mohammed bin Salman again as long as he's the ruler. We'll never sell arms to the Saudis. You know, that's it. That was Sunday. Today, the president comes out. He's being pressed. What do you say about these conclusions? And finally, he has to acknowledge he's studied them. And he says, well, they're not conclusive. And maybe he did it, maybe he didn't. Literally, that's what he said. Maybe he did it, maybe he didn't. But this is an ally that we can't ignore because we're selling them billions, $450 billion in deals that I negotiated back when he was in Riyadh in May of 2017.
Are we selling them that much?
Well, actually not. In fact, the figure is closer to 14.5 billion, and it's only contracted. It's not really a done deal.
Did he get confused with the extra zero?
No, he just keeps adding zeros. And also, he questioned the CIA's conclusions, which are once again doing what he did on day one of his presidency, going to Langley and questioning the intelligence community and undermining them, and also saying there's oil, and we've got to keep the price of oil down. So we've got oil, we've got our alliance against Iran, which is, of course, a primary focus of his decision to get out of the Iran nuclear deal, and they are our ally, and there are some things that are more important, basically, than human rights, is what he was saying. So that broke during our
business deals are more important than human rights. He put a price on a human life.
Now, what people like John McLaughlin, the acting CIA director, retired, would say is, we can do more than one thing with an alliance. Yes, Saudi Arabia is an important ally. It has been to Democratic and Republican presidents, but never before have we had a modern president who has said that human rights is not an American value. And we're talking about even the Bush administration, which was very close to the Saudis, could not ignore what the 19 Saudi-born hijackers did. So we've crossed a bar today. This is not just a minor decision in saying that our foreign policy is going to be determined by dollars, by oil, and by shared opposition to Iran, which is what's got us into a horrendous war in Yemen.
But there's also something more insidious that was revealed in that statement. When Donald Trump repeated the Saudi propaganda that called Khashoggi an enemy of the people, what he essentially is saying to other authoritarians, and this is what Richard Engel, our colleague, tweeted that he was being told by human rights advocates. What they're saying to other authoritarians is, as long as you declare someone an enemy of the people, an enemy of the state, does it sound familiar, enemy of the people? That it's okay to kill them. And we're not going to be bothered.
And suggesting that he was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is part of the talking points, the smear campaign by the Saudis against Khashoggi. The publisher of the Washington Post tonight issued a statement saying that this is a complete rejection of the American values of human rights. Fred Ryan, who previously, worked for Republican administrations before he was the publisher of the Washington Post. It's a really troubling turning point in American foreign policy.
We have one other breaking news story, and then we're going to get to the good stuff. The other breaking news story, which is uniquely in your wheelhouse, is something about emails. I think there was somebody in this administration who got in trouble over emails. The president's daughter using her own private email server in order to conduct official White House business.
And the fact that Ivanka Trump used emails, private emails for official business, it is a violation potentially of the Presidential Record Act, which is to preserve everything that happens in the White House, in the administration, her husband as well. The White House is saying it's different from Hillary Clinton's because it was not a private server in her basement in Chappaqua. But the other issue is that they say, Hillary Clinton destroyed emails, 33,000. Well, that actually was her option under the current system, where the individual at the State Department can decide what's private, what's personal, but not defending what happened there, but it was not
giving
illegal.
Context.
But that is the context. The other thing is that they said, there were 110 classified emails of Clinton's and that Ivanka Trump's were not classified. Well, the fact is that Hillary Clinton's were not classified when she sent them. They were classified retroactively by the intelligence community, looking back over them and saying, well, this should have been classified. So we don't know what's going to happen with Trump.
Do a bit of pushback and tell me where this, there's a couple places where it could differ. Ivanka Trump is not the Secretary of State.
Exactly.
But is there a reason to believe that some of her emails might have been sensitive, might have contained information about foreign leaders or any foreign policy information?
It's possible. It's certainly not as sensitive as the Secretary of State, a cabinet secretary, but she is a very close advisor and is completely, embedded in the inner circle. That said, I'm not saying this is the biggest issue, but it's politically embarrassing. And for her to say she was unaware of the requirement, given the fact that in the 2016 campaign, this was the defining issue that her father used against Clinton. And I'm not, having covered every minute of that campaign, I'd be the first to tell you that Hillary Clinton was too defensive in March of 2015 when the New York Times first exposed the server. If she had come right out and said, I screwed up. And it would have almost been over, but it was the defensiveness, because that was broken on March 8th, 2015, if I'm correct. And 8 days later, she had a news conference at the Security Council in the United Nations, very defensive, standing, shouted questions. We then had her announcement on Roosevelt Island of her campaign, the listening tour. We spent the whole summer traveling with her, and she didn't do her first sit-down interview until September 4th, Labor Day. It was with me, when she finally answered questions about the emails rather than on a rope line and in a shouted context. So that was the way her campaign fed into the narrative that Donald Trump then seized upon. Seeing how she was so defensive, he branded her with it. And the mainstream media, all of us, social media, got swept up in it way too much. I think we have a lot to answer for with the way we covered that campaign. I've revisited that, I've said it publicly, I've written about it. And what really happened, may I say, Katy? Katy was a correspondent in London. In July of 2015, I was parked in Vienna, waiting for the Iran deal to either come together or fall apart, covering John Kerry. And we thought it would be a week, 2 weeks. We were there a month. And mid-July, I think?
8th.
July 8th. Somebody came down an escalator at Trump Tower.
Oh, no, sorry. This was June, I think it was June 15th.
Okay, June.
Brad. We have our producer yelling it from the crowd. June 15th.
June 15th, while we were leading up to the breakout of the Iran deal, Donald Trump came down that escalator in Trump Tower. Katy Tur, poor soul, was on home leave from London, which, as she wrote in her book, she had a carton of milk in the refrigerator that she hadn't gotten back to.
And a French boyfriend in Paris. More importantly.
You're better off without that French boyfriend. She now has a wonderful husband instead.
An American.
An American. Nothing against the French, please. But the fact is, she was then assigned to go over to Trump Tower and ended up with the big interview with Donald Trump. We had it on live. I was
I went on. We wrapped it, so we played the whole interview in full, where he, called me naive and et cetera. And afterwards, you were the one chewing over it with Chuck Todd. And I remember being gobsmacked that I was sitting in that seat, having an interview I did with a political interview I did with a presidential candidate, being analyzed by Andrea Mitchell, and you said something so astute. You just off the top of your head, you saw it for the first time live on air, and you said his numbers on immigration are all wrong. You talked about how many people were coming over the border and how it had lessened, and you had an instantaneous fact check for that interview. And for me, it was a real lesson on how to cover Donald Trump going forward. But this is not about me.
Okay.
I wanted
to make it about her.
How many presidents have you covered?
I think it's 7.
7.
I covered Jimmy Carter as a junior correspondent. Shout out, I was the backup to Judy Woodruff, my closest friend in the world, whose birthday it is today. She's 2 weeks younger than I, so I call her my younger sister. But so Judy was taking a break. She had fallen in love and wanted holidays off, so I filled in Plains, Georgia, and that's how I got to cover Jimmy Carter.
So Jimmy Carter, then Ronald Reagan.
Ronald
then
Reagan, 2 terms.
George Bush.
Yeah, and Kennebunkport, which is a wonderful upgrade from Plains, but a downgrade from Santa Barbara. Well, maybe it's not so much, but both coasts. We sometimes judge the presidents we cover by where we go on their long
President
vacations.
Obama. Hawaii.
President Obama. I never got to Hawaii, so I covered him from the State Department perch, at summits. But Bill Clinton, I covered the whole campaign. I had been the congressional correspondent by then, and I was covering Congress, the Senate, the House. Fascinating period, and it was a great education. And then in 1992 was assigned to be the Bill Clinton
And if you watch the
campaign
documentary on
candidate.
A&E about Clinton and Lewinsky, you'll see Andrea Mitchell in like every single
Popping up.
shot trying to ask Clinton a question.
But you know, Katy, I regret that you didn't have that experience. The best campaign I've ever covered was 1992. Not because of the players, but because we traveled by bus across the country with Clinton and Gore, right from Madison Square Garden, where the convention was. And we actually had what you could call retail politics, seeing people, talking to people, not flying to big rallies and being herded into a pen. And the bus would stop, he would see a crowd. We used to joke that he would stop for any size crowd. One night in Iowa, it was almost 2 a.m, and he stopped at a crossroads, and I swear it was a bar emptying out. And we were exhausted. We all had to get up for the morning shows, and Al Gore was saying, if he does not stop giving the speech and talking to people and shaking hands, the Secret Service is going to have to lock me up because I'm going to be a danger to his health. But the fact is that Bill Clinton would talk to anyone, anytime, anywhere, and we got to meet everybody across the country. It was a wonderful experience. The problem I had also was there were 3 candidates in the race, and when the day in June 5th, 1992, Bill Clinton nailed the nomination. I thought I should be the lead of the nightly news in a political year. Ross Perot was beating both George Herbert Walker Bush and Bill Clinton in the polls, and that was the lead story that night. The correspondent covering Ross Perot. So it was not as predetermined as anyone might remember that Bill Clinton was going to win the presidency.
You know, our other colleague, Steve Kornacki, wrote a great book about that. You can read about that in his book. Are we ever going to go back to campaigning like that? Will there be presidential candidates who do that sort of bus tour and opt for smaller, more intimate settings and get out with the people instead of flying into big rallies at hangars and flying
I
out?
fear that social media, a combination of the technology, which we didn't have in 1992.
Lucky.
Covering a bus tour, I'll explain in a moment. I think we'll never get back to that kind of retail politics just because of the Trump phenomenon. I hope we can get away from this kind of campaigning and get back to something that is more closely approximating a real conversation with the American people that has to do with policies, subjects like education and housing and climate change and all the other things that I think we should be covering. But when you think back to 1992, we had cell phones that were pretty primitive back then, and computers that were hopeless. So the way we covered it was I'd get on the bus and take notes and jump off at every stop, followed by an NBC Winnebago, an RV, with a producer with a walkie-talkie. I had a walkie-talkie. She had a tape editor. We weren't feeding raw tape in live.
You were editing it in
We
real
were
time.
editing in the field
Wow.
in real time. So we're driving along, I-95 or whatever in the Winnebago, or I'm in the bus, and then at a certain point in time, I would be calling her on the walkie-talkie and saying, at 12:32:59, that's a time code of day.
12 minutes, 32 seconds, 32 seconds,
Right.
12
12
hours, 52. Wow, you got
He
it.
said something great. The in cue is this, the out cue is this, cue that up, I want that to be. And I would be, writing on a portable typewriter, an Olivetti portable typewriter, and we didn't have laptops. We had these big bulky desktops. and they were dial-ups. So if you were out of cell range, forget it. You could lose your whole script. So then at a certain time of day, I would get off the bus, get on the Winnebago, work with her on the script, try to get approval. I mean,
it must have been so nice not having a producer change everything at the last minute,
well,
because you couldn't do it.
There's an old story that Sam Donaldson would file as late as possible so that they couldn't change anything from A to Z, even when he was at the White House. But then we would have to stop at about 5:30, 5:45 in the Winnebago, do the nightly news piece, and then drive like, hell to catch up with the rest of them when they would stop for dinner or something, and then start all over and do the morning piece. It was great.
There's nothing like covering a campaign. I know I got a weird experience, but I look back on it strangely fondly. It's one of those things that becomes addictive. And I wondered when I would watch you doing campaign after campaign, God, doesn't she want to quit doing this? Isn't it exhausting? And I get it now. It is, there's an adrenaline rush. It's fascinating.
Well, when Andy Lack asked me in 2015, do you have one more in you? I said, oh yeah, absolutely. And in 2011, I was slated to do the campaign, and I got sick, and I was devastated because I thought I wouldn't be able to do it. But I was able to come back from that. And
please, there's no sickness that could keep you from doing your job.
It was because NBC had the faith in me and stood by me when I was going through that. It was breast cancer, and it was a tough crisis in my life.
Breast cancer's no match for you.
Let's hope.
I want to ask you. I mean, you've seen so much. You've been doing this since Carter. What has changed for you, for reporters?
It's interesting you asked that. Last night I was in Washington doing a book event with Marvin Kalb. Marvin Kalb, the dean of the State Department correspondence for years. He was actually one of the Murrow boys, one of the last hired Murrow boys, and he's got a book called Enemy of the People. And he interrupted his work on his memoir to write this book while he's at the Brookings Institution. We'd interviewed him on Meet the Press. I'd had him on my program, and I'd promised him that I would do this book event last night. And at Politics and Prose, that wonderful independent bookstore in Washington. And it was standing room only. It was wonderful to see everyone turning out for this event. And he explained why he went from the objective, quote unquote, journalist that he had been for a lifetime, 60 years in journalism, host of Meet the Press, State Department correspondent for NBC. More often, for more years than that, State Department correspondent for Henry Kissinger on, covering foreign policy for CBS, starting out in 1956 in Moscow, where he started writing about what it was like to cover the Russians. So he said he felt compelled because of his fear that journalism is being destroyed in our current climate by being described as the enemy of the people. That watching the campaign you covered as a new political correspondent, you'd covered politics before, I think in New York and all, but you were mostly a foreign correspondent. You were covering the war in Ukraine. You were covering the plane crash and all of the aftermath there.
I was everything but American politics.
But Marvin Kalb, now felt compelled to stop working on his memoir and write this book called Enemy of the People. And he believes we're at an inflection point. And I was asking him, how is it different? And he said, well, you know how it's different. And how it's different is that we now have to do fact check, as we did when he was announcing on the immigration issue. We have to do it minute by minute, second by second.
And it doesn't matter.
And it doesn't matter. And that's the other thing. But we still have to do it. I don't want to be in this adversarial position. I think there's a healthy give and take with presidents, with politicians of all stripes. I've covered Democratic presidents and Republican presidents, and I'm always sort of sometimes the loudmouth, asking questions, shouting questions at Reagan. I loved covering Ronald Reagan. I loved arms control, and I covered all of the summits with Gorbachev, and it was fascinating. And he didn't like being, shouted at. But I'll tell you, it was my very first White House press conference. Reagan, couldn't remember our names. He couldn't tell the difference between Leslie Stahl and Judy Woodruff, the two frontline women correspondents. But he knew something about civility and about the appropriate relationship of the Fourth Estate. So September 1981, I hadn't covered him in the campaign. I'd covered the Democrats in the 80 campaign. He didn't know me. I didn't know him. I'm in the White House filling in for Judy Woodruff initially, and then assigned to cover the White House after the assassination attempt in March. And he's going to have the first press conference since I had arrived there. And I was, as the junior correspondent to Judy Woodruff and the late John Palmer, I was the shouter, the designated shouter, yelling questions when he went to and from the helicopter. And so they would give him a picture book with the pictures of the correspondents, and we would be arrayed. On the one side would be the crazies, the people who would shout questions and be really, really off the wall. In the middle would be the mainstream media, and on the other side would be the easy,
the friendly.
And so they would tell him, call on the regulars, the mainstream media, but if you, get in trouble, call on the friendlies. And if you really get in trouble and want to get the audience, and this was prime time in the East Room, he always did them in prime time. If you really want to get the American people to sympathize with you, call on the shouters, the real crazy ones. There were people there who were really a little off the rails.
It's so interesting. I never knew they categorized.
And
reporters
that's
like that.
really why Donald Trump called on Jim Acosta that day.
Totally.
He was trying to set up that context. So I was kind of, in the middle, in the back, my first press conference, and my bureau chief said to me, he'll never call on you. You're going to be sitting, you don't have a regular seat. You're not you're not the number one. You're not the number two. You're in that third extra seat under the cameras. But, wear something bright, wear red, which I did.
Ellen Thomas always said that.
And I didn't know that he was going to call on me. But my bureau chief said, just make sure you have a question ready. And I had been shouting and yelling at him at the choppers. So he calls on, Helen Thomas. He calls on the Associated Press reporter. He calls on one of the first network big shots. And then he says, now, Andrea, what is it you've been trying so hard to ask me? And literally, and what happened, I later discovered by talking to Jim Baker and his other aides, was he was going through the picture book, and they knew who I was and what I was up to. And he said, I want to call on this one. And they said, no, you don't. And he said, no, yes, I do. She's been working so hard.
Were you in the crazies?
No, I was in the back, in the back.
And so there's a fourth.
And then
category,
another quick Reagan example to tell you how different this experience is. And it happened with Bill Clinton when I asked him about Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and he was furious, but he answered the question. It happens so often with presidents. They don't like to be put up against, put on defense, but they understand that that's the deal. This president enjoys the press, really is accessible at moments, stopping and walking in and out, but not in real follow-up moments. But he still calls us the enemy of the people. He has branded us this way, and it's taken. And it has diminished not only the power and the authority, but the credibility of the news media. And I think in a very, very damaging way.
It's also diminished the credibility of the White House.
Oh, absolutely.
Beyond Donald Trump, the credibility.
And one other
of the White
quick
House.
Reagan story. At the height of Iran-Contra, we had a really dramatic news conference with the president in the East Room in 1987. And Don Regan was still the chief of staff who had overseen this disaster until Nancy Reagan basically got him fired, but did it much more diplomatically than Melania Trump. Got rid of the Deputy National Security Advisor recently. And the president called on me, and it was a very important news conference, and I was really ready with a question about the secret decision to sell missiles to a third country. And he called on me, and the tape shows, he said, "Well, Andrea," and the New York Times reporter sitting in front of me jumped up and took my question. And so I thought, well, I'm sunk now. I'm not going to get a question. Helen Thomas says, "Thank you, Mr. President." And before he leaves, he says, "Wait a second, I owe Andrea a question." And I asked him the question, and it was the question that elicited the response where he misspoke. He denied, selling the missiles to Iran and having Israel pay for it. And I had asked him with enough facts from, officials. So I went back to our little cubicle, the White House booth, and it was 8:35, 8:36 p.m. prime time. And at like 5 minutes to 9, the White House announces on the loudspeaker, "The president has a correction." And we all ran up, and they issued a 2-line correction. "The president misspoke. He did not mean to say this." And I ran as fast as I've ever run out to the lawn where my senior colleague, was on the air still till 9 o'clock. Tom Brokaw was anchoring. Chris Wallace was our chief correspondent. I was the number 2. And I ran, and I got down on my hands and knees and handed him the piece of paper. So I was below the camera so he could get on the air before we went off. And we got it on the air, and I went back to the booth, and the phone rang, and it was Don Regan threatening to get me fired. And for asking the question. And he chewed me out, and the words he used, and it was just, I was shaking with fear.
So in that way, not much has changed. There's always been,
Yeah,
well,
no,
a lot has changed. But in that way, it's not as if it's not as if you're always getting polite phone calls from politicians.
No, but Don Regan was fired for it. He was not fired for that, but he was fired for hanging up on the First Lady. But he was a rogue character, really, in that context.
There were consequences.
And the president would not tolerate that.
Yeah. You have we could go through Mayor Rizzo and what he said to you, the way he treated you. There's a long list of examples we can use. I do want to ask you one question before we get to some of the audience questions. How has it changed for you being a woman? And if you could touch on the 3 Mile Island story.
I got in a little bit of trouble, I guess, over that. Maybe not. I was talking to Rachel Maddow one day when we were...
exemplifies.
Well, there were only 2 women in our bureau in those days. And 3 Mile Island broke. I was the energy correspondent, so it was my beat. I was covering nuclear power. And the bureau chief, who's still a friend, in fact, we're going to be doing an interview together. He's advanced in age, but he's a retired veteran journalist. But he was the bureau chief then at NBC, and he didn't send me. And day after day, I was covering the story from Washington, but I wanted to get to Middleburg, Pennsylvania, and get there. And the first couple of days, and he was rotating correspondents in because we did not know how much radiation had been released. They hadn't really good measurements. It took them almost a year to really figure out what the damage was, and it wasn't that significant. But it came very close to meltdown. And finally, Carol Simpson, then my colleague, and I marched into the bureau chief's office and said, why haven't we been sent? Because he would send someone in for 24 hours and then send another person in so nobody would be exposed to too much radiation. And I said, I'm the energy correspondent. And he said, because you're of childbearing age, and I don't want to expose you to radiation. And in those days, you didn't talk like this to your boss. And I said, we're live streaming, it's okay. I said, has it ever occurred to you, Sid, that men's balls are as vulnerable to radiation as women's ovaries?
I'm gonna clap.
And he sent me the next day, and I was there for a year.
I would get down and bow to you right now, but I won't.
Let me just say one other thing, because it's 40 years since this happened. I did a report last Friday night on Nightly News about Jonestown. And I knew the basic facts. I had been there. Our correspondent and cameraman were killed on the tarmac, along with Congressman Leo Ryan. And our sound man, Steve Sung, was grievously injured. Jackie Spear, who's now a congresswoman from California, almost died on the tarmac. And I was sent in. I was called. I was a brand new correspondent, and I was sent in because our correspondent had been killed. And I'd never been overseas for NBC, and I didn't do a good job. Long story short, I wanted to do a 40-year anniversary story and interview Jackie Spear. And I got very emotional last week interviewing her, and we put the piece together. And for the first time, I really looked at the video, because our cameraman and our correspondent had been covering it documentary style. So everything she told me about how a note was passed to our correspondent that some of these people who were claiming to be so enthusiastic wanted to leave. 40 people wanted to leave. So she started taking statements from them. She was a young staff attorney. And when they finally went to leave, someone from Jim Jones, the cult leader team, tried to stab the congressman. He got away, and they started running to get to the tarmac. And then a truck rolled up, and they started shooting everyone. She crawled under the plane after trying to reach to Ryan, and he was down, and our cameraman was killed, and Don Harris was killed. And she almost lost an arm and a leg. So all of this was going on, and I went in afterwards. And I came back, and I was so traumatized, but didn't realize it, that I got to my house in Washington, got out of a yellow cab from the airport, sat down on my front step, and started crying, sobbing. Went back to work, never dealt with it. Threw out all my clothes. The smell of going through Jonestown after 900 people had been murdered, because it was not a suicide, it was a murder, it was mind control. And those who refused were injected with the cyanide, the Kool-Aid laced with cyanide. And years later, I ran into James Reston Jr., who had written a book about it and had been down there. And we were at a book party, and I was talking to his wife, and we were talking about the effects of Jonestown. And I said, I still have nightmares about it. It was long before anyone talked about PTSD. And she said, didn't you get some help? And I said, what kind of help? Being a woman, it never occurred to me to come back to Washington and say to my bureau, I need some help dealing with this. Because I didn't want to not get the next assignment, because that's the difference. We now have so many women. We have all of you women road warriors out there. We have women bosses. One of my former State Department producers is now the executive producer of the Today program, Libby Least. The first producer of my MSNBC show, Jennifer Suazo, is the executive producer of NBC Nightly News. Each of them are the first women producers of these broadcasts. Jen Suazo, is the first woman to produce any evening news broadcast on any of the networks. So we are surrounded by colleagues, young, middle-aged, older, veterans, and it's so reaffirming, and it has made an enormous difference.
Almost our entire campaign team in 2016 was women. You, Kristen Welker, me, and Hallie Jackson, and Casey Hunt. We have time for a couple questions from the audience if we go through them quickly. First off, 2018 is winding down. What do you think the biggest story of the year is?
Wow.
It's a hard one.
It hasn't wound down yet. It may well be.
Yeah, there could be more to come.
I mean, it may well be the Mueller report or indictments.
Do you think it'll come out before the end of the year?
I do. I think something is going to happen between now. I'm not saying it's going to be conclusive. It may not get to all of the issues of Russia's role and what happened. We already know from the two previous sets of indictments about Russia's role in social media and Russia's military intelligence role, but what we don't know is, was there an American connection?
I'm going to be out of town from the 30th to the 10th. Am I safe to go out of town?
No. But you should.
Oh, God. Takeaway from the midterm elections. What's your takeaway?
And just, it's undisputed that the Democrats have made tremendous, advances in terms of the House Democrats. The numbers are now, as we speak, 37 pickup seats. It may well be closer to 40 by the time the last races are determined. Not so much on the Senate side, but the governor's races are really important in terms of what happens in 2020 and what happens in state houses and state legislatures with the Senate to come. So very big pickups in Midwestern states that were very important, obviously, for the 77,000 votes in Wisconsin and Michigan that led to, and of course, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had a Democratic governor, but the switchovers in those state houses are going to be very important. But how the Democrats handle it, they have to come up with a balancing act. I covered Congress when Newt Gingrich was rising and becoming the Republican, Speaker of the House, but coming through the ranks and taking over a very different Republican Party. And if you overdo it, it backfires. Mm-hmm. And that's how Bill Clinton
98
got reelected in 1996.
96.
And that's how the impeachment backfired against Republicans after that in the 98 elections.
In one sentence, if you can do it, best part of the job, worst part of the job.
Best part of the job is all the breaking news, the excitement. Worst part of the job, all the breaking news and the excitement.
Do you sleep?
No. I mean, if I do make that train, which is the last train that's going to get me home tonight, I'm going to try to sleep because I don't have an assignment in the morning. But I've been going since 5 o'clock this morning, and I didn't get in until I got in at 1 o'clock this morning from Washington because I'd promised Marvin I would do his event. So I took that last flight out of Washington last night. So I don't sleep enough.
You guys are all lazy in comparison to
No,
Andrea Mitchell.
it's just I do love what I do. If you can tell, I'm very enthusiastic. I have a passion for this. I'm going to do it until I don't do it well, and then figure out the next phase of my life.
Final question.
Yeah.
I'm going to repeat a question that was posed to you in 2015 by one of our bosses. Do you have one more in you, 2020?
Yeah, I want to see this through. I probably will not be a road warrior, which I was, going around through 2015 and 2016, plus covering State Department trips and things in between. But I do want to be on the road. I want to cover big issues. I love having my show at noon Eastern, which is a great opportunity to explore all sorts of ideas. We get interrupted a lot with live events, and that's frustrating when you have these wonderful guests like you want to come to. But it's such a privilege, and it's such a privilege to work for a great network, to have cable, to be able to write for our website, which I love doing, to be on NBC, the broadcast side. We have all of these platforms to see, the next generation. Savannah Sellers is a great young star coming up in the ranks, and to see one of the people on my show today was Vaughn Hilliard, reporting from Mississippi. He was my researcher. He's now on the air and doing great things all over the country. He's in Arizona and covered that great Senate race. And to work with you, Katy Tur, is a privilege.
You've led by wonderful example. Andrea Mitchell.
Thank you all.
Thank you.